Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute for American Democracy's Constitution Series, Equality and Justice for All. My name is Miles Link. I'm an emeritus professor of law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University and senior assistant disciplinary counsel in the District of Columbia's Office of Disciplinary Counsel. On behalf of Justice O'Connor and the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute, we are delighted to have you with us. Today, we are honored to have with us Ms. Colleen Jenkins, the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Mr. Kenneth Morris Jr., a descendant of both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. President of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative, Kenneth B. Morris Jr. is descended from two of the most important names in American history. He is the great-great-great-grandson of the American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman Frederick Douglass, and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington, educator, author, orator, and advisor to multiple presidents of the United States. After the Civil War, Douglass also became active in the women's suffrage movement. In 1866, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, he founded the American Equal Rights Association to advocate for universal suffrage in the United States. Colleen Jenkins, the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, is a legislator, author, and television producer. She is the founder and president of the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Trust, a collection of 3,000 objects of women's suffrage memorabilia that has been lent to presidential libraries, museums, book publishers, documentary film producers, and television programs. Through the years, she has worked to promote awareness of and pride in the history of women in the United States. It was in 1848 that the movement for women's suffrage achieved national recognition with the Seneca Falls Convention, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Following the convention and the sustained efforts of the suffragists and their allies over many, many years, it was in 1920 that the discrimination in voting based on gender was outlawed by the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Today, we will explore the entwined histories of abolition and suffrage through the legacies of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, and Booker T. Washington. Colleen and Kenneth represent three significant figures in civil rights history, and they continue to work to carry on the important history of their families that impacted our nation. We also will learn the differences between the words suffragette and suffragist. As we begin our program, we invite you to send in your questions during our Q&A following their presentation via YouTube live chat or a Facebook comment. Now, please join me in welcoming Ms. Colleen Jenkins and Mr. Kenneth Morris Jr. Colleen.
Thank you very much, Miles. I appreciate your sensitivity to words. It was drilled into my head. So I would like to introduce you to my family. This is a picture of my family. And in the middle is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who you probably know as a pioneer in women's rights. Of course, we are all mortal, so it's very good to have succession built in. So her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, was a major New York State suffrage organizer. She organized parades up Fifth Avenue, and the Western United States was much more advanced than the East. And finally, New York State was a tipping point for the states east of the Mississippi, granting women the right to vote. And then I'd like you to know my grandmother, who has photobombed this Zoom presentation. So I'm going to take a little bit unusual way of talking about my family. I'd like to start with my grandmother as a child. No, sorry, my great-great-grandmother as a child. She was the daughter of Judge Daniel Cady. He was a judge in their town near Albany, New York. He served on the New York State Supreme Court. He was elected to Congress. He also, back then in the early 1800s, there were to study law, you studied with a court, with a judge. So there were law clerks in the home and environs of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So obviously he had Elizabeth plus many children. Sadly, his last son died when the son had just graduated from college. So all he has left is daughters, 5 daughters. So a lot of his aspirations left in terms of when his last son left. So one of the daughters is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I want to tell about when she was 10 years old. She got this coral necklace as a Christmas present. And one of the law clerks baited her. He said, "That present, who owns it?" And she says, "I own it. I got it as a Christmas present." And he says, "Well, when you get married, that necklace will belong to him. He can lock it up, or he can take it and swap it for a box of cigars, and it will go up in smoke." So that's a simple lesson of marital women's property rights. And that was the truth, that essentially a married woman ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. She could not contract. This is an old concept of coverture, that she could not contract, that only her husband had the right of ownership of her wages or the clothes on her back or her children. So what's interesting, already at 10 years old, she is figuring out what is right and wrong. And I would like to show you my next object. Obviously, the law was all over the state of New York. Judge Cady's, whose law office was attached to their home, had a whole bunch of books like this. And so one of the concepts Elizabeth did, because she did not like the distraught women who would go into Judge Cady's law office for counsel, and they would come out equally distressed. So she cooked up this plan that she'd take his law book from his office and a pair of scissors, and she would quite simply cut out those nasty paragraphs that made women so unhappy. I hope that Miles doesn't mind that I hurt one of a law book, and because essentially laws need to be amended when they're wrong, and even a child can know when something is wrong. But her father told her, "You can cut out my law books, but it doesn't change the law. You have to go to the lawmakers, who were all men, who had constructed the law. You must go to them and lobby." And actually, she did grow up. She did go to the New York State legislature and did appeal to them. Of course, she had no rights of her own. She couldn't serve in that legislature. She couldn't vote for those representatives. But anyway, as this child, she is learning what's right and wrong, and she's learning that correlation to law, and she's also learning the correlation to women. So let's fast forward. She gets married, and she marries an abolitionist who's a lawyer. And where do you go when you get married in Upper New York State in the early 1800s? Well, you could go to Niagara Falls for your honeymoon. No, what they did is they went to London for the first World Anti-Slavery Convention. She went as a bride, 25-year-old. Henry was the secretary of that convention. Well, and then another very important person went, Lucretia. She crossed the Atlantic as a delegate to the convention. She was old Stanton and had a great deal more experience, and she was a delegate. What was the ordinance at the first World Anti-Slavery Convention? You may think it could have been about or the abolition of slavery. Well, in fact, the first business was to decide whether women should speak or not speak. The decision was, and for Elizabeth, she was more of an observer. Lucretia Mott, that's totally different. So anyway, Lucretia and Elizabeth meet, and for the first time, and they go around London and they said, we have a problem. Women have a problem. We need to address it. And so they wanted to mimic that idea of a conference. And fast forward to 1848. So now Elizabeth is going to, with Lucretia Mott, who's come up from visiting her in the area. And so here's Elizabeth. She's 32 years old. Most people think Elizabeth is always an old white-haired woman. No, she's 32 now. She's got kids. And she is a very frustrated woman. And that comes out. And just within a matter of days, the handful of women, essentially Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and some local women, Lucretia Mott's relatives, they decide we are going to have our own convention. It becomes the first women's rights convention. And so out of it comes not the Declaration of Independence, but comes the words, which are not all men are created equal, but all men and women are created equal. The Declaration of Sentiments, which is the Women's Declaration of Independence. So this Stanton focuses on one resolution, elective franchise, which means the vote. And Lucretia Mott and a few others said, "Thee will make us ridiculous. You're outrageous. You're undermining our other things." And there's only one man who stood up and said her with his eloquent speech. And that was Frederick Douglass. So fast forward, we are celebrating a long struggle. And that's why I like to show you 3 generations of my family, because all 3 were involved in a 72-year struggle to change the U.S. Constitution, to amend it. And a lot of people think this amendment is about women. Well, it's not women. Can I read it to you? We're celebrating the 100th anniversary. Let me read it. It says, "The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." I like this. Only the second sentence in that whole amendment says, "Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." So 1920, the 19th Amendment passes. And because we're always a country, hopefully making a more perfect union, Congress act to enforce this in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act. So I'm thrilled to be a part of Sandra Day O'Connor Institute. You're keeping her legacy alive. She is the first woman to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. She had the duty to interpret the Constitution. And I want to not just look backwards. It's easy to celebrate the 19th Amendment and voting rights. I want to look forward. The forward look is, yes, it's great to have voting rights protected. But what about your other rights? What about equal rights? And that's why I'm very excited that we have passed the bar, the very difficult bar of having 38 states ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. This is history being made right now. Virginia just became the 38th state. What is the Equal Rights Amendment? It's just like the 19th Amendment, few words different. It says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Why I like this is it's everybody's rights. It's not just women's rights, it's everybody's rights. So I look forward to the archivist of the U.S. Constitution publishing the 28th Amendment. And now I would love to turn this session over to a person I met recently on the front lawn of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house in Seneca Falls when we were celebrating convention days of the original Women's Rights Convention. And it is an indescribable pleasure, a joy to meet this man. His name is Ken Morris, but I like to call him Fred.
Thank you, Colleen. It's so good to be back with you. I enjoy doing these presentations, and I want to congratulate you on the monument in Central Park. And did you want to just share a little bit about that before I jump into my part?
I'm prepared. This is the first. See, Sandra Day O'Connor's first. This is the first statue of real women, not Alice in Wonderland, in Central Park after only 165 years of Central Park's existence. And Ken, the table behind me is the table that's actually used in the statue. And there's a little drawer here, and I like to pull things out. And this is what somebody wrote: "We the people." So I think that's what it's all about. Who are we people? And I turn it over to you, person.
Yes, we the people. And that is just wonderful. I got a chance to look at the coverage on NBC that morning, and it was just a beautiful thing to see. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm honored to be able to join you and talk about the rich history of my family and my ancestors, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. I want to thank the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute and Mr. Miles Link for being the moderator for this program. You know, as I was introduced, I think I heard Miles say that I'm the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. Wow. And I'm also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to these influential American heroes, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And you may have a hard time sitting there trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and to Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know a grandparent. Some of you may have even known a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors. Because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, was Booker T. Washington's daughter, and she lived to be 95. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And several years ago, I was with a group of students, and they were looking at me cross-eyed like, man, you are so far removed. And what does all of this history have to do with our lives today? And why are you talking about these people that lived so long ago? And so I was trying to give them some context to help them understand how close we are in the generations. And I had this thought that I think was kind of profound, that hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man. I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country when you consider the generations of families. So before I jump into the stories of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, I have to address a couple of questions that I get all the time. The first question is, so I know Douglass and Washington weren't related to each other. How is it you're related to both of them? And then the other question I get is, so you're related to Douglass and to Washington. Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. So as you can imagine, there has been this kind of weight of expectation that I've carried around most of my life, trying to step out of the shadows of two great American heroes. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to share my screen here and show you how I descend from the family. So I'm going to put this up and hopefully you can see this. So it happened on my mother's side of the family. In the center of the picture is my grandmother, my mother's mother, Nettie Hancock Washington. She's Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. And on the left of the screen is my grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, and he's Frederick Douglass's grandson. My grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee Normal School and Institute, which is a school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881 at the age of 25 years old. My grandparents happened to be on campus the same day, and they were rushing across to get to the other side and literally bumped into each other, didn't know that the other descended from an historic family, and they fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married just 3 months later. And so when my mom, Nettie Washington Douglass, was born, she was the first person to unite the bloodlines of these historic families. My mom was an only child, so when I was born, I had the honor and privilege of being the first male to carry that dual lineage. Also in the photograph on the right is my grandmother's brother, Booker T. Washington III. So the significance of this photo is you have Frederick Douglass III shaking hands with Booker T. Washington III, and thus the families are officially united. Now, as we know, we're commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment this year. So I'm going to take just a few moments to talk about my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass, because there would be no Frederick Douglass without Anna in his life. They met while he was enslaved in Baltimore, and she was really the first person to plant the seed of thought in his mind that, Frederick, you're not meant to be a slave. And as they started to think about their lives together, she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. Now, she was the first person in her family to be born free, so she knew freedom, and she envisioned a life together. Had she not sold her personal belongings to help finance his escape, had she not sewn the sailor's disguise that he would wear to escape, who knows if Frederick Douglass would have had the courage to run away, and we would be a very different country today without the contributions of Anna Murray Douglass. He would escape by train and then by boat and then land in New York City, write a letter back to Anna. She would come and join him. They would get married and take on the name Frederick and Anna Johnson. And with the help of conductors on the Underground Railroad, they would make their way to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and 2 weeks later, settle down, take on the name Frederick Douglass, and then begin their lives together. Anna was a conductor on the Underground Railroad out of their home in Rochester, New York, where she helped to ferry hundreds of freedom seekers to their freedom in Canada. So she's a very important part of this story. Now, here's Booker T. Washington and my great-great-grandmother, Olivia Davidson. She was instrumental in helping Booker build Tuskegee through her fundraising prowess and her outspoken activism. And so she's a very important part of this story. So in our family, it's not just about the famous men that we've heard about, but the women that are working alongside these great men to accomplish the things that they did. Now, what I'm going to do here through these series of photographs is show you how close I am through 3 pictures to Frederick Douglass. In this photo, you see Frederick's grandson, Joseph. Joseph is my great-grandfather. In the next photo, you see Joseph as an older man. He's with my great-grandmother, Fanny. She's the one that lived to be 103. On her lap is my grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, and his sister, Blanche. And in this photo, you know, I love showing this picture to students because I ask them, you know, do you recognize anybody in the picture? And they'll say, yes, that's you. And about half of them will think that I'm the older one, and the other half will think I'm the younger one. Well, I am the older one. And then sometimes the kids will make a joke and they'll say, yeah, that's Michael Jackson. I recognize him. So, you know, I wanted to be Michael Jackson and be in the Jackson 5, but sitting there is my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, and she was about 101 years old in that photograph. So Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born into slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was born to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his master was his father. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 6 or 7 years old. He used to sleep head first in an old corn sack with his feet hanging out on cold winter nights because that was the only way that he could try and keep himself warm. He only saw his mother 4 or 5 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields, picking cotton from sun up to sundown, and then walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face some sort of punishment. Now, in Frederick Douglass's first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was published in 1845, he wrote about this time in his life that he described as divine providence in his favor. And that was, he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's family. The importance of this move was he was leaving an environment where he wasn't around people that could teach him to read and write, because as we know from our US history, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. But now he was going to be in Baltimore. He was going to be in a big city around free Black children and also around poor white children. But what happened most importantly when he got there, his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before. And she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. She was just this kind Christian lady with a good heart. And she was teaching her son, Tommy, how to read. And next to Tommy was Frederick with his eyes wide open, ready to learn, eager to learn. And so she just naturally began to teach him his ABCs. And that was all he needed, was that little spark of light into his mental darkness. And the lessons would continue for a while until his enslaver found out about him. And he got angry. And Hugh Auld looked at his wife and he looked at Frederick and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." Now, I hope you all heard that message, because Frederick heard it loud and clear, and he looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge was power and that education would be his pathway to freedom. And that is a message that still is as relevant today as it was all of those years ago. And so as Frederick would teach himself to read and write, he would start to think critically about his condition of enslavement and oppression. And while he's praying to God to deliver him from his bondage, from his chains, he would say to God, I don't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday and goes to church, and in the word and cherry-picked scripture and verses finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property. He's starting to make the differentiation between what he would later call the slave-holding Christianity of the land versus the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. And then he would do what the master predicted would happen. He would start to ask questions like, why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday and I don't know my birthday? He was becoming unfit to be enslaved. Now, I don't have time to go through the whole story this afternoon, but I will fast forward and say that at the age of 20, on September 3rd, 1838, with the help of Anna, he would escape by train and by boat. And as I mentioned, they would settle in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where a couple of years later, he would attend an anti-slavery meeting on Nantucket Island. And when the abolitionists heard that they had this fugitive slave in the audience, they asked Frederick, will you just stand up? Will you tell the audience your story? What was it like to be a slave? And in that first autobiography, again, he wrote, I was so nervous the first time speaking in front of a white audience that I was shaking from every limb. But when he stood up and began to speak, he had this natural gift for communication. He was eloquent. He was charismatic. He was theatrical. He was even funny in some of the descriptions about the characters that he came into contact with when he was enslaved. And so the abolitionists knew that they had a star in their hands. They asked Frederick to join them as a paid lecturer, and he would travel from town to town, city to city, just telling his story. Well, then he started to have a problem. And that problem was people started to doubt that he'd ever been enslaved. They couldn't wrap their minds around what they thought an enslaved person looked and sounded like and what they were seeing in Frederick Douglass. So in order to prove he was who he claimed to be, he wrote that autobiography, The Narrative. It was published in 1845, but then he had another problem. It became a bestseller. And that's the last thing that you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your enslaver. So he would have to flee to Europe for a couple of years as kind of a cooling off period. He would land in this town called Newcastle upon Tyne in England. And with the help of his abolitionist friends who did a fundraiser, they were able to raise enough money to purchase his freedom from his enslaver for $711. He would return back to the United States a free man. The family would settle in Rochester, New York, where he would begin to publish the North Star newspaper, which became the leading abolitionist voice. And then in 1848, as you heard in Colleen's presentation, he would attend the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. And he was sitting in the audience when that contentious debate broke out between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott about asserting a women's suffrage resolution into the Declaration of Sentiments. Elizabeth Cady Stanton asked her friend Frederick Douglass to stand up and speak, and he spoke eloquently in favor of inserting the resolution, and then it passed unanimously. And I am proud of my great ancestor for a lot of things, but I think I'm most proud of his commitment to women's rights throughout his life and throughout his career. And he was one of 32 men that signed the Declaration of Sentiments that day. He would go on to become the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American Ambassador and Consul General to Haiti, first African-American Recorder of Deeds in the District of Columbia, and the first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor. And the list goes on and on. And sometimes when people would ask Frederick, they wanted to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education? And having never spent one day of his life in a classroom, he would respond on occasion by saying, my degree is written on my back. Booker T. Washington benefited from the work of Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists in the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he was freed in Virginia when he was about 9 years old. And he wanted to go to school so badly that he worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia at night so he could begin his lessons during the day, with the goal of going to a place called Hampton Institute to get an education. And at the age of 16 years old, when he had finally saved enough money and with the help of his community, he would make a 500-mile walk to go to school. Now, that walk took a long time. He ran out of money on several occasions. He had to take odd jobs along the way. He slept outside. He slept under bridges. There were no obstacles too great, no challenges that were insurmountable for him to overcome to get that education. And that is a great lesson for young people today, to see that our ancestors, the people that came before us, wanted to get an education so badly that they would walk 500 miles to go to school. He would eventually get admitted into Hampton. After being turned away many times, he wouldn't take no for an answer, and he kept coming back. And then finally, he was admitted. He was given the job of a janitor so he could work his way through college. 4 years later, he would graduate. He would eventually come back to Hampton as a teacher. And then in 1881, he accepted a position down in a place called Tuskegee, Alabama, to start a school for formerly enslaved people. And so Booker was excited to do this, and he rushed down to Tuskegee And he's looking around for an old church or an old schoolhouse somewhere where he could begin his lessons, but there was nothing but dirt, nothing but farmland as far as the eye could see. But he didn't get discouraged. He started recruiting students and started getting them excited about getting an education. And then one of the first things that he taught them to do was to make bricks. He taught them to make bricks so they could build their own school. Now, Booker understood that you couldn't start reaching for the higher aims in life until you could meet your basic needs in life. So at Tuskegee, that education started sometimes with hygiene, teaching them how to tie their shoes, how to brush their teeth. But what he taught them most importantly was a trade so that they could have a stake in the nation's growing economy. And Booker T understood that coming out of 400 years of oppression and enslavement and the racist ideology that fueled that he wasn't going to get people just to change their racist ideas. And so what he did was he showed freed African Americans how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. Washington was a leader who brought stability in a time of transition from enslavement to freedom. And it may be said that he's the person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. And so now I come into the picture, and I'm about 5 or 6 years old when I start to notice that my ancestors are on statues, they're on money, postage stamps, schools are named for them, bridges are named for them. And everywhere I turned, I could feel this long, vast shadow of my ancestors. And the few times that I told people of my relationship when I was younger, nobody ever believed me. And I never thought that it was a point worth arguing. So I spent really most of my life not talking about this incredible heritage that I have and really running away from it. And that was until 2005 when I read a National Geographic magazine, and the cover story was 21st Century Slaves. And it was about human trafficking and modern day slavery existing in every country around the world, including right here in the United States. And I read another article about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men almost every single day. And the night that I was reading that article, I was sitting in my living room, and down the hallway, my girls were getting ready for bed. My older daughter, Jenna, was 12. She's the same age as this girl that I'm reading about. And my younger daughter, Nicole, was 9. And that night when I went in to say goodnight to them, I had this moment where I couldn't look them in the eyes. I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And it was really at that moment that I understood that I had this platform that my ancestors had built through struggle and through sacrifice. And perhaps we could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this. So we started thinking about how could we get involved? Well, you have Frederick Douglass and his legacy as a great abolitionist on one side, Booker T. Washington as a great educator on the other side. Abolition through education. How can we unfit communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive? Remember that Frederick Douglass story when he was enslaved at 9 years old? Well, we use education to be able to prevent human trafficking and to prevent young people, reduce their vulnerability to being trafficked for labor and for sex. And I'll close my portion of the presentation just to talk about, one idea that we spend a lot of time with young people. We developed service learning and civic engagement curricula, and our programs are in schools throughout the country. We also have an online training program for educators on how to deliver human trafficking prevention education in the classroom, starting in the elementary level and the secondary level. That program is called Protect. And I remember talking to a group of sixth graders. And a 10-year-old girl raised her hand and she said, "Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree and I found that my great, four greats grandmother was born into slavery. And I thought I had a lot of greats, but she was proud of every one of those greats. She said she was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write in secret. And then she ran away and she became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist. And she knew exactly what that word meant. And she was very proud of it. And so she's bouncing up and down in her chair. And so she said, "So Mr. Morris, do you know what all of this means?" And before I could answer, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do. And I will never forget that, because we all have greatness flowing through our veins. We all stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us. And each and every one of us has an ancestor that may have given of their lives just for the freedoms that we have in this country, may have given of their lives just so that some of us have the right to get an education and have the right to vote. And when a young person starts to understand that they have greatness flowing through their veins, you see them sitting up straighter in their chairs. You see them more empowered to go out into the community and do this civic engagement work. History lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forth. And I thank you very much again for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And thank you to each and every one of you that are listening and watching today.
Thank you very much, Colleen and Ken. Colleen, I have to say, when I saw you take those scissors to that law book, I almost had a heart attack. I've never seen that done before, and I hope to never see that done again.
Oh, it will come, because we must amend the Constitution again.
Yeah, well, amend it, yes. Tear it up, no. Colleen, I'd like to put my first question to you, and it's the question regarding language. And if you explain to me, and if you could explain to the group, the difference between suffragette, which I think is a term familiar to many, and suffragist, which is a very important distinction.
Well, of course, I'm very influenced by my family. And there was always a dignity about suffragist. It's somebody, suffragist. It's somebody who believes in suffrage. And suffragette, et is sort of diminutive, for instance, or fake. For instance, leatherette. It's not really leather. Or kitchenette. It's half a kitchen. Or majorette. It's not, the full-fledged major of an army. It's somebody who twirls, baton, I think. So it was just drilled into my head, and it's a much larger message than just words. It's how do you define yourself? And so in America, suffragist was used vastly more than in England, where suffragette was basically a derogatory name that a group took on and used it. So I hope that answers your question, Miles.
It does. I'm curious, and this question now goes out to both of you. Clearly, you have incredible personal histories, and they are also very significant at this moment in our collective national life today. What do you think your ancestors would say about civil rights today? We had the great flowering in the 1960s. Colleen, you referenced the Civil Rights Act, and we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Fast forward, we're in the 21st century. We're in the beginning of the second decade in the 21st century. Ken, let me start with you, but I'd like both of you to chime in. What do you think your ancestors would say about our American passage today with respect to civil rights and equal rights?
Well, as president of Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, I think about what would Frederick Douglass do, what would he say every day if he were here today. And it's difficult to know exactly what he would do or say, but because his blood flows through my veins, I'll take some liberty and say that I believe that he would be somewhat pleased that we have made some progress. We elected the first African-American president of the United States. And of course, with the recent election of the first female and African-American vice president-elect, future vice president of the United States, he would be pleased, I'm sure, with that progress, but I think he would be very upset to see how far we still have to go for equal rights for everyone, and fighting against injustice, fighting for equality. When we talk to young people about this history And in the same way that Frederick started to think critically about his condition of enslavement and oppression, we want young people to think about their condition and ask questions like, why do I have less access to education and healthcare and environmental justice and equal opportunity because I'm born into a certain zip code versus someone else who's born into another zip code through no fault of their own? And in the same way that Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists looked at this legal institution of slavery. I mean, we've got a lot of problems and challenges and issues today, but imagine living at a time in the 19th century where your federal government said it's legal to own you and illegal to teach you. I think many people would run away from that challenge, and thank goodness Frederick Douglass and many others didn't. So we want young people today to look at these institutions that exist today where racism runs systemically throughout American life and start to question them and start to think about ways in which they can begin to dismantle these systems. You know, Frederick Douglass had a great quote that I love. He said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." And in this day that we're in, being so politically divided and with all of the rhetoric out there that's sexist and racist and xenophobic and homophobic, I think our focus is to build strong children, not that we've given up on repairing broken men and women, but we focus at the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives on building strong children.
Colleen?
Great. So you asked about what would Elizabeth Cady Stanton think of today? And what we have to do is extrapolate by who is she? She seems to be always ahead of her times, maybe 60, 70 years ahead of her times. Because she was demanding the vote, elective franchise in 1848, and to change the Constitution, amend it, was 1920. So let's take that time frame. Let's plunk her down today in 2020, and let's try and figure out how she thinks. Well, she is going to be thinking 70 years ahead of time. So, of course, the Equal Rights Amendment has been adopted by the U.S. Constitution. And now the fun begins. The fun begins because the law of our land says that we are equals. And I think that that's just imagine, for instance, the freedom of speech, the First Amendment, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. What does that all mean? Well, we spent like 200 years, 250 years trying to figure that thing out. For instance, you're not allowed to scream fire in a crowded movie theater because that could create a stampede and panic. So, but our founding fathers, of course, the founding mothers were not at the table, but the founding fathers had no idea that we would have movies. And so I think it's really exciting to think in 70 years, what is Elizabeth thinking about the equality of, and it's not just of women, like women having equal pay for equal work, but I would challenge men. What do you want in terms of equality? Join the bandwagon, because this is equality of all sexes. It's not just women have driven it since the 1970s, been very, very active in the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. But I think it's a little quiet on the men's side. So I think Elizabeth would be challenging us to think about this an incredible definition of who we are as people. We keep preaching this stuff, like all men are equal. Well, what did that mean at the time? It was basically men with property, and a little bit later, white men without property, and then finally, after the Civil War, black men. Well, 51% of the population was left out. So we have to continue evolving to a more perfect union and really live. All men are equal. All men and women are equal. I think that's what she would be challenging us on today.
Thank you. Ken, apropos of that, men need to stand up and play a role. It is striking that Frederick Douglass did that Yet the question arises, why? Why? There were many other men who were active in the abolitionist movement who were not as active in the suffragette movement, in the suffragist movement. What do you think, to the extent you can illuminate it, caused him to expand his view, if you will, to embrace gender equality as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really attribute it to a couple of things. Number one, he understood what injustice felt like because he had experienced it firsthand, being enslaved for 20 years. But, I mentioned during my presentation that he published his autobiography, and then he would have to flee to Europe for a couple of years. And he would land in Ireland and get there really amidst the potato famine. And he looked around and he saw people suffering that didn't look like him. When he first arrived, he was there to talk about the abolition of slavery and breaking the chains of his brethren that were toiling away in bondage. But as he looked around and he saw this kind of suffering, it made him think differently about injustice. He also had a mentor, the great liberator, Daniel O'Connell. And O'Connell was an abolitionist as well. And O'Connell really helped Douglass to start to develop an internationalist mindset to fighting for human rights for everybody. And when he came back to the United States, a free man, I think that it was something that he understood that he needed to do. He also, as an enslaved boy, hardly had any contact with his mother, very little contact with his grandmother until he was about 5 years old. He had siblings, 5 siblings that were like strangers to him. So you had this boy who had no family, he had no home, and he had no country. But in spite of all of that, he was able to rise up to effect positive change for all of us. And I think that just knowing what injustice felt like firsthand, the time that he spent in Ireland, I think really contributed to his wanting to fight for human rights for everyone, including women, of course.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. Questions come from one of the audience about looking at Frederick Douglass's work. Would he embrace a libertarian form of government today, including the concept of defunding the police? What do you think of that?
Yeah, now that's you were getting into sticky territory when we talk about politics, because every political party wants to embrace Frederick Douglass for better or for worse, and we know that he was a Republican, which today's Republican Party is very different from the party that he was a part of, and that said he had a famous quote. He said, "I'll be a dyed in the wool Republican." But the fact is toward the end of his life, he was moving away from the Republican Party because he saw that the right-wing faction of the party was moving away from the interests of his people. Of course, we don't know what Frederick Douglass would be today. I believe that he probably would be an independent, and he would be doing the same thing that he did through 3 autobiographies and thousands of essays and publications in his newspaper, the North Star. He would be speaking truth to power, and he would be agitating. There's a great story at the end of his life. He lived in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C., at a home which is now the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. It's where he spent the last 17 years of his life. And he used to walk around the neighborhood and interact with the children, and he loved to play baseball with them. And this young man walked up to Frederick and said, "I'm interested in fighting for justice and equality. What advice would you give to a young man like me?" And without hesitation, the great abolitionist responded, "Agitate, agitate, agitate." And so I know that he would still be agitating today. And so at least I could say that much.
Thank you. Colleen, I'll give you the last question. In the suffragist movement, there were, despite Frederick Douglass's involvement and engagement, there were nonetheless tensions along racial lines within the movement. And Black suffragists like Ida B. Wells and others were often marginalized. Can you talk a little bit about that and about why that took place?
Well, great. So just to let you know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1902. And what a period that you're talking about is particularly the 1913 parade, march in Washington, D.C. And I think what's interesting is Ida B. Wells had difficulty marching with Illinois, but she's my type of woman. She quite simply persisted, and she ended up marching with the state of Illinois. She is somewhat like Shirley Chisholm is, that has the expression, if there's not a seat for you at the table, you bring your folding chair. And I want to talk about another group in that parade that I have enormous admiration for, and it is the Deltas. And that was a sorority that was founded in 1913, the same time as that parade. And they decided that they were going to march in that parade, march in the march. That was a big suffrage march in Washington at the same time as the inauguration happened. They usurped the power of the inauguration. Well, this group had to have chaperones to get off campus, and they marched in the march. And what was the most beautiful thing for me to see is when I went back down to Washington, D.C. in 2013, which was the 100th anniversary of the Deltas, but also of that march. I was amazed at what these Deltas had done. Thousands of them had shown up for this march, and I marched with the Connecticut section of the Deltas. And I mean, you had judges, you had you had professors, you had the psychology department of Morehouse College, and you have teacher from Georgia. I Skyped with her class. It was just an amazing evolution of what our society was. So that was deeply touching to me. Can I just answer one other question about the women's Bible? Sure. Somebody mentioned it in the comments section. So I already told you at 32, Elizabeth is a radical. Well, why not just keep being a radical up until your 80s? And basically, what she took on the Bible. She took on institutionalized religion. Why? Because she felt that that was one of the greatest hindrances of women's advancement. If you, as a sex, shall graciously submit, and if all the hierarchy above you is male, it had to be addressed. And so she wrote the Women's Bible, which was very radical. One minister called it the work of the devil. And she reminded the minister that the committee were all females and he was not there.
Thank you very much. By the way, the Delta sorority is Delta Sigma Theta, and it was formed, as Colleen said, in 1913 at Howard University, and it was created, in fact, so that its members could engage in support of the 19th Amendment. Thank you, Colleen and Ken, for leading this discussion, which was both illuminating and instructive. We thank our audience and our sponsors for being with us today. To learn more about the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute for American Democracy, visit o'connorinstitute.org. Thank you all for being with us.
I thank everyone, especially Sandra Day O'Connor, for bringing us together.
Yes.
Here, here.